Sometimes the truth doesn't need a voice, it just needs someone willing to see it. The apron hit the floor with a soft sound, almost too quiet for how loud the moment felt. Conversations faded. Forks paused midair. And for a second, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Emily Carter didn't look at anyone as she untied the last string around her waist. Her movements were steady, practiced, as if she had done this before or had prepared herself for it long ago. "I'm sorry, sir." The manager's voice rang sharper than necessary, cutting through the silence. "But we cannot tolerate this kind of behavior here." No one asked what behavior. No one questioned the accusation. The man in the tailored suit, the one who had complained, sat back in his chair with quiet satisfaction, swirling the ice in his glass like the outcome had already been decided long before Emily spoke her first word. She didn't defend herself. Not when the manager pointed toward the exit. Not when a few guests exchanged knowing glances. Not even when someone near the window whispered, "I knew something felt off about her." Emily simply nodded once. Calm. Controlled. Her fingers trembled just slightly as she folded the apron over her arm, but her face remained composed, her eyes clear, almost distant. "Thank you for the opportunity," she said softly, her voice neither bitter nor broken. Just finished. Across the room, Jonathan Blake set down his fork. He hadn't touched his meal in several minutes. Not since the moment the complaint began. While others watched the scene, he watched something else entirely. The receipt on the edge of the table. The numbers didn't sit right. Not at first glance. But long enough they shifted. Patterns emerged. A detail out of place. He didn't look at Emily. Not yet. Instead, he reached for the paper, sliding it closer with quiet precision. Around him, the restaurant slowly returned to motion, like nothing important had happened. Chairs scraped. Glasses clinked. Life resumed. But Jonathan remained still. His eyes narrowed slightly as he read the line again. And again. Meanwhile, Emily stepped toward the door, her steps measured, her posture straight despite the weight pressing silently against her shoulders. She passed by tables of strangers who had already moved on, their attention drifting back to conversations and phones and half-finished meals. To them, it was over. Just another waitress. Just another mistake. But as she reached the threshold, something slipped from her hand. A small folded note. It fell unnoticed to the floor behind her. Or, at least unnoticed by everyone except one person. Jonathan Blake leaned down, picking it up between his fingers. He unfolded it slowly, his expression unreadable. Inside, written in neat, precise handwriting, was a single line of numbers. A calculation. Off by just enough to matter. His gaze lifted then, finally following the direction Emily had gone. And for the first time, something shifted in his eyes. Not curiosity. Not surprise. Recognition. Jonathan Blake did not stand up right away as Emily disappeared through the door, the note still resting between his fingers, the faint indentation of her handwriting pressing into the paper as if it carried more weight than ink alone, and while the room returned to its usual rhythm around him, he remained still, his attention narrowing on the numbers that did not belong, because they were not random, they were intentional, precise, almost like a warning left behind for someone who would know how to read it. And slowly, almost absent-mindedly, he reached for the receipt again, placing it side by side with the note, aligning the columns, matching the figures, and there it was, subtle but undeniable. A discrepancy buried deep enough to pass unnoticed by anyone who trusted the system but clear enough for someone who questioned it, and Jonathan exhaled quietly, not in surprise but in confirmation. Because this was not about a wrong order or a careless mistake. This was structure. Repetition, a pattern that had likely been happening long before tonight. And across the room, the manager laughed lightly with the complaining guest, their voices relaxed now, confident, as if the situation had been handled perfectly, as if nothing of value had just walked out that door, and Jonathan's gaze lifted, calm but focused, watching them for a brief moment before he folded the note carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his movements unhurried, controlled, the kind of control built over years of seeing what others missed, and when he finally stood, the chair moved softly against the floor, barely drawing attention, but the shift in his presence was enough to change the air around him, because some people did not need to raise their voice to be heard. They only needed to stand, and as he approached the manager, the man turned with a practiced smile, the kind reserved for customers who looked important, but the smile faltered just slightly when he recognized who was standing in front of him, and for the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered beneath the surface. "Mr. Blake, I hope everything is to your satisfaction," the manager said, adjusting his tie, his tone suddenly more careful, more measured, and Jonathan did not respond immediately, instead, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable, his eyes steady, unreadable, before he spoke, his voice low, even, carrying no accusation yet holding undeniable weight. "I would like to see the full transaction log for that table," and the manager blinked, caught off guard, his confidence slipping just enough to reveal hesitation. "I assure you, sir, everything has already been resolved," he replied quickly, too quickly, and Jonathan tilted his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in quiet observation, as if noting something worth remembering. "Resolved is not the same as correct," he said, and the words landed heavier than their volume suggested, because they were not loud, they were certain, and around them, a few nearby guests began to notice again, sensing the shift, the subtle tension returning to the room, not dramatic, not chaotic, just enough to make people listen without knowing why, and the manager forced a polite chuckle, attempting to regain control. "It was a simple misunderstanding. The waitress made an error, and we handled it according to policy," but Jonathan's gaze did not move, did not soften. "Then it should be very easy to show me," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it, not demanding, not aggressive, just inevitable, like a door that had already begun to open and could no longer be closed, and for the first time, the manager hesitated long enough for the silence to speak for him, while outside, beyond the glass doors, Emily Carter stepped into the cool evening air, unaware that the moment she left behind had not ended, it had only just begun. The manager's smile held for 1 second too long before it broke, not dramatically, but just enough to reveal the strain underneath, and he gestured toward the back office with a stiff motion, inviting Jonathan Blake to follow, because refusing was no longer an option, not with the quiet pressure now filling the room, and as they moved past the dining area, conversations lowered again, eyes tracking them with subtle curiosity, sensing that something unfinished was unfolding beneath the surface, something that had not ended when the waitress walked out the door, and inside the office, the air felt different, smaller, stripped of performance, just a desk, a monitor, and the soft hum of equipment that suddenly seemed louder than it should have been, and the manager moved. Quickly, almost too quickly, logging into the system, his fingers tapping against the keyboard with a rhythm that betrayed his attempt to appear composed, while Jonathan stood behind him, not leaning, not interrupting, simply watching, the way someone watches a clock they already know is running out, and when the transaction log appeared on the screen, rows of numbers lined up neatly, clean, organized, convincing at first glance, the kind of data that reassures people who do not look twice, but Jonathan did not speak. He stepped closer, his gaze scanning, moving slowly, deliberately, until he stopped, just for a fraction of a second, and that was enough, because patterns do not need to shout, they only need to repeat, and there it was again, the same subtle shift, the same adjustment hidden within different tables, different times, different receipts, always small enough to avoid suspicion, always consistent enough to mean intention, and Jonathan reached into his jacket, pulling out the folded note, placing it gently on the desk beside the keyboard, aligning it with the numbers on the screen, and the manager's eyes followed the movement, widening slightly before he could control it, and that was the moment everything changed, not because of what was said, but because of what could no longer be denied. "She tried to tell you," Jonathan said quietly, not accusing, not raising his voice, just stating something that had already become true, and the manager swallowed, his throat tightening as he looked back at the screen, then at the note, then away entirely, as if distance could undo what had been seen. This could be a system error," he said, but even he did not sound convinced, and Jonathan shook his head once, slow, certain. "System errors do not repeat with precision. he replied, and the words settled into the room with a weight that did not need emphasis, because they were not dramatic, they were final. And outside, a light breeze moved through the street as Emily Carter stood near the corner, her arms folded lightly against the evening chill, her eyes fixed somewhere distant, not on the restaurant behind her, not on the people inside, but on something quieter, something internal, as if she had already accepted the outcome long before it happened, as if walking away had not been a reaction but a decision. And inside the office, the manager leaned back slightly, the reality pressing in from all sides now, not loud, not chaotic, just undeniable, and Jonathan remained still, his presence steady, unwavering, because this was not about catching someone in a mistake. It was about recognizing someone who had tried to stop one, and for the first time since the evening began, the story shifted, not in volume, not in spectacle, but in direction, because the truth had not entered the room. It had been there all along, waiting for someone willing to see it. The manager's chair creaked softly as he leaned back, the sound small but heavy in the quiet office, and for a moment he said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because every explanation he could reach for felt thinner than the truth sitting in front of him, and Jonathan Blake did not rush him, did not press, he simply stood there, allowing the silence to do what words could not, and eventually the manager exhaled, slow, controlled, like someone realizing the room had shifted in a way he could not fix. "This does not change what happened on the floor," he said finally, his voice lower now, less certain. She still handled the situation improperly, and Jonathan's gaze moved from the screen to the man, steady, unblinking. "She tried to correct it," he replied, "and you stopped her." And the manager opened his mouth, then closed it again, because denial required confidence, and confidence was something he no longer had. And outside the office, the restaurant continued its quiet performance, unaware that the foundation beneath it had just cracked, and Jonathan reached for the mouse, scrolling through more entries, each line confirming what the last had suggested, adjustments made after orders were placed, totals shifted by small margins, enough to accumulate, never enough to trigger alarms, unless someone was looking for them, unless someone like Emily had noticed. And that thought settled differently, not as a possibility, but as a realization, because she had not been careless. She had been careful, careful enough to see what others ignored, careful enough to leave evidence without confrontation, and Jonathan straightened slightly, his decision forming without urgency but with certainty. "Pull the records from the last 30 days, he said, his tone unchanged. But the request was no longer optional, and the manager hesitated again. A fraction of a second, but it was enough. Enough to confirm everything that needed confirming, and he turned back to the screen, hands moving slower now, less practiced, more deliberate, as if each key carried consequence, and as the data loaded, the pattern widened, no longer isolated, no longer explainable, just clear, consistent, undeniable, and Jonathan stepped back, giving the man space he did not deserve but needed, because this was not about pressure, it was about exposure, and when the manager finally spoke again, his voice had changed, stripped of authority, reduced to something closer to admission. "I did not think anyone would notice," he said quietly, not looking up, and Jonathan did not react, because surprise would have been dishonest. "She noticed," he said instead, and those two words carried more weight than anything else in the room, because they shifted the entire narrative, from mistake to awareness, from dismissal to injustice, and the manager swallowed hard. The reality settling deeper now, not just that he had been wrong, but that he had silenced the one person who had been right, and outside, Emily Carter had begun to walk, her steps unhurried, her path uncertain but her posture unchanged, and she did not know that inside, the story was being rewritten, not loudly, not dramatically, but piece by piece, number by number, until the version that remained was the one that should have been heard from the beginning, and Jonathan glanced once toward the door, not in hesitation but in recognition, because some people leave quietly, but they leave something behind that refuses to be ignored, and tonight, that something was no longer hidden. Jonathan Blake did not raise his voice, and yet the weight of the moment pressed harder than any accusation could have, and the manager sat there, staring at the screen as if the numbers might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough, but they did not. They stayed exactly where they were, quiet and precise, and for the first time that evening, the power in the room had shifted completely, not through force, not through volume, but through clarity, and Jonathan reached forward, closing the transaction log with a calm, deliberate motion, as if the evidence no longer needed to be displayed to remain true. "You dismissed the only person who understood what was happening here," he said, and the manager's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension giving way to something closer to resignation, because there was no defense left that did not sound hollow, and outside the office, the restaurant carried on, unaware that the story it believed had already been decided was quietly being rewritten behind a closed door, and Jonathan adjusted his jacket, his movements composed, measured, as if every step from this point forward had already been considered. "Call your regional director," he added, his tone unchanged, but the implication unmistakable, and the manager looked up, startled, not because he did not understand, but because he understood too well, and for a brief second, something like fear crossed his face, quickly hidden, but not quickly enough, and he nodded, reaching for his phone with a hand that was no longer steady, while Jonathan turned toward the door, pausing only long enough to glance once more at the desk, at the note Emily had written, still lying there, simple, unassuming, yet powerful enough to change everything. And then he stepped back into the dining room, where the lights were still warm, the conversation still soft, and the illusion of normalcy still intact, but it did not feel the same anymore, not to those who sensed the shift, not to those who noticed that something unseen had just been brought into focus, and Jonathan walked past the tables without hurry, his gaze briefly sweeping the room, not searching, not judging, just observing, until he reached the front entrance, and as the door opened, the cool evening air met him, carrying with it the faint echo of footsteps already gone, and across the street, under the soft glow of a street lamp, Emily Carter stood waiting at the crosswalk, her figure still, her expression unreadable, as if she had nowhere urgent to be, as if leaving had not been an escape but a quiet acceptance, and Jonathan watched her for a moment, not calling out, not interrupting, because some moments required distance to be understood, and when the light changed, she stepped forward, crossing the street without looking back, unaware that behind her, the consequences of what she had seen, what she had tried to reveal, were now unfolding in a way no one in that restaurant had expected, and Jonathan remained where he was for a second longer, then followed, not to catch up, not to stop her, but because the truth she had left behind was no longer something he intended to leave unfinished. Emily Carter did not hear the footsteps behind her at first, not because they were quiet, but because her mind was louder, filled with the steady echo of everything she had chosen not to say, and she kept walking, her pace even, her shoulders relaxed in a way that only came from acceptance, not defeat, and the city moved around her without noticing, cars passing, lights changing, people crossing paths without looking twice, and for a moment, she was just another figure in motion, another story. No one would stop to understand, until a voice, calm and measured, reached her just as she stepped onto the sidewalk across the street. "You knew," and she stopped, not startled, not rushed, just still, her hand tightening slightly around the strap of her bag before she turned, slowly, meeting the gaze of Jonathan Blake, who stood a few steps behind her, his expression unreadable but his presence unmistakable, and for a second, neither of them spoke, because the moment did not require urgency. It required precision, and Emily tilted her head just slightly, her eyes steady. "I suspected," she replied, her voice soft but clear, and Jonathan nodded once, as if confirming something he had already understood. "You tried to fix it," he said, not as a question, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of pride, but of quiet acknowledgement. "I tried to show it," she corrected gently, and the distinction lingered between them, subtle but important, because she had not tried to control the outcome, only to reveal what was already there, and Jonathan studied her for a moment longer, taking in the calm in her posture, the absence of frustration in her voice, the way she stood without needing to prove anything, and it was that, more than the numbers, more than the note, that settled his certainty. "Why did you not say anything when they accused you?" he asked, and Emily looked past him briefly, toward the restaurant across the street, its lights warm, its windows reflecting a version of the evening that had already moved on. And then she looked back at him, her expression unchanged, because they were not listening. She said simply, and there was no bitterness in it, no edge, just a statement of fact, and Jonathan exhaled quietly, not in frustration, but in recognition, because he had seen it too. The way the room had decided before the truth had a chance to speak, and for a moment, the city noise filled the space between them, grounding the conversation in something real, something present. And then he reached into his jacket, pulling out the folded note, holding it up slightly. "You left this," he said, and Emily glanced at it, her eyes softening just a fraction. "I thought someone might notice," she replied, and Jonathan gave the slightest nod. "Someone did," he said, and the words carried no weight of self-importance, only acknowledgement of timing, of alignment, and Emily looked at him then more directly, as if seeing him not as a billionaire, not as a stranger, but as the one person who had chosen to pause, to look twice, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them, not agreement, not obligation, just understanding, and Jonathan lowered his hand, slipping the note back into his pocket. "They're going to correct what happened," he said, and Emily's expression did not change, not with relief, not with expectation, just a quiet stillness that suggested the outcome no longer defined her, and she nodded once, polite, composed. "I hope they listen next time," she said, and then, without waiting for a response, she turned slightly, preparing to continue walking, because for her, the moment had already served its purpose. The truth had been seen, and that was enough. But as she took her first step forward, Jonathan spoke again. Not louder, not urgent, just enough to reach her. "Emily." And she paused just for a second, her name landing differently than anything else that had been said that night, because it meant he had not just seen the numbers. He had seen her, and slowly, she turned back once more, her eyes meeting his, calm, steady, waiting, not for permission, not for opportunity, but simply for what would come next. Jonathan Blake did not rush his next words, because he understood that what came after a name mattered more than the name itself, and Emily Carter stood there, waiting without expectation, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if she had already accepted that whatever followed would not define her direction, and Jonathan took a small step closer, not to close the distance, but to meet her at the same level, his voice steady. "You saw something most people would have ignored," he said. And Emily gave a slight shrug, not dismissive, just honest. "It was there," she replied, and the simplicity of her answer carried more depth than any explanation could have, because she was not claiming insight. She was acknowledging attention, and Jonathan studied her for a moment, the way he had studied the numbers, looking for exaggeration, for performance, for anything that did not align, but there was none, only quiet certainty, and he nodded once. "The records confirm it," he said. "They will correct the system, and the manager will be held accountable." And Emily listened, her eyes steady, but there was no visible relief, no shift in her stance, as if the outcome, while right, was not what she had been waiting for, and Jonathan noticed that, because he noticed what did not change just as much as what did. "You could come back," he added, not as an order, not as an assumption, just an option placed gently into the space between them, and Emily's gaze softened slightly, not in gratitude, but in understanding, and she looked past him again, toward the restaurant, then back at him. "I do not think that is where I am supposed to be anymore," she said, and her voice carried no resentment, no rejection, just clarity, and for a brief moment, the city noise seemed to fade again, leaving only the quiet weight of a decision that had already been made long before the offer was spoken. And Jonathan did not argue, because he recognized finality when he saw it, the same way he recognized truth in a column of numbers, and instead, he shifted slightly, his tone unchanged but his intent more focused. "Then let me ask you something else," he said, and Emily remained still, attentive, not cautious, just present. "What were you doing there?" he continued, because that was not just observation, and for the first time, a faint pause entered her expression, not hesitation, but consideration, as if deciding how much of the truth belonged in this moment, and then she answered, quietly, "I studied finance." she said, and the words settled between them, simple, direct, and Jonathan's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in doubt, but in confirmation, because it aligned too cleanly with everything he had seen. "And you left that to work there?" he asked, and Emily gave the smallest shake of her head. "I paused," she corrected, and the distinction lingered again, subtle but deliberate, and Jonathan let out a quiet breath, something close to respect forming beneath the surface, because she had not lost direction. She had chosen patience, and that was something few people understood, and he nodded once more, slower this time. "You see patterns," he said, not as a compliment, but as a fact, and Emily met his gaze evenly. "I pay attention," she replied, and the difference, once again, mattered, and Jonathan allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch his expression, not of amusement, but of recognition, because attention, when consistent, became something far more valuable than talent, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between them filled not with uncertainty, but with possibility, quiet, unspoken, waiting not to be forced, but to be understood. And then Jonathan spoke again, his voice steady, certain. "I could use someone who pays attention," and the words did not carry pressure, only invitation, and Emily looked at him, really looked this time, not at the suit, not at the status, but at the intention behind the offer, and for the first time that evening, the moment did not feel like an ending. It felt like something else entirely, something just beginning, though neither of them rushed to name it. Emily Carter did not answer right away, and the pause that followed was not hesitation, it was evaluation, the kind that measured more than words, more than opportunity, and she looked at Jonathan Blake with a calm that had not shifted since the moment he first spoke her name, as if she understood that what he was offering was not just a position, not just a role, but a direction, and directions, once taken, were not easily undone, and the city continued around them, headlights passing, footsteps echoing, but neither of them moved, because the moment required stillness, and Emily finally exhaled softly, her gaze steady. "You do not know me," she said, not as a rejection, but as a boundary, and Jonathan nodded once, accepting the truth in it without resistance. "I know what you saw," he replied, "and I know how you handled it," and his voice carried no urgency, only certainty, the kind that did not push, only remained. And Emily studied him for a second longer, searching not for promises, but for intention, and what she found did not come from his words. It came from what he had already done, the way he had paused, the way he had looked again when everyone else had already decided, and that mattered more than anything he could say now, and she shifted her weight slightly, her posture still composed, but something in her expression softened, not fully, not yet, just enough to acknowledge the possibility. "Why?" she asked quietly, and the question was simple, but it carried depth because it was not about the offer, it was about the reason behind it, and Jonathan did not answer immediately, not because he needed time, but because he chose his words carefully, because people who pay attention do not create noise, he said, they create clarity, and he held her gaze as he continued, and clarity is rare, and the words settled between them, not dramatic, not persuasive, just true in a way that did not need to be proven. And Emily lowered her eyes for a brief moment, not in doubt, but in thought, as if weighing not the opportunity, but herself within it, and then she looked back up, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded. "I am not looking for a favor," she said, and Jonathan gave a slight shake of his head. "Neither am I," he replied, and there was no negotiation in his tone, no attempt to convince, only alignment, and for a second, the distance between them felt different, not smaller, but clearer, like 2 points finally connected by something invisible but undeniable, and across the street, the restaurant doors opened again, a few employees stepping outside, their voices low, their expressions tense, as if the consequences inside had already begun to surface, and Emily glanced briefly in that direction, then back at Jonathan, and there was no regret in her eyes, no desire to return, only closure, quiet and complete, and she reached into her bag, pulling out a small notebook, worn at the edges, flipping it open with practiced ease, and after a brief moment, She tore out a page, writing something quickly, her handwriting precise, controlled, the same as the note he now carried, and she handed it to him without explanation, and Jonathan took it, glancing down, recognizing not numbers this time, but a name, an email, simple, direct, nothing more than what was necessary. And when he looked back up, she was already stepping away, not abruptly, not dramatically, just moving forward, because for her, decisions were not performances, they were actions, and as she walked, she did not look back, not out of indifference, but because she no longer needed to, and Jonathan remained where he was, the paper in his hand, the moment settling into something lasting, not because it was loud, but because it was clear. And as the city carried on around him, one thing had changed in a way that would not return to what it was before, not the restaurant, not the numbers, and not the quiet understanding that sometimes the most valuable thing a person could offer was not what they said, but what they chose to see. The next morning arrived without announcement, just a quiet shift in light as the city moved from shadow into clarity, and inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was different, not louder, not chaotic, but unsettled in a way that could not be hidden behind polished surfaces and practiced smiles, because the illusion had been broken, and once something is seen, it cannot return to being unseen, and the manager stood behind the counter, his posture rigid, his voice measured but lacking the confidence it once carried, as conversations among staff remained low, cautious, eyes avoiding the places where certainty used to live, and at exactly 9 o'clock, a black sedan pulled up outside, its presence subtle but unmistakable, and Jonathan Blake stepped out, his pace unhurried, his expression unchanged, carrying with him the same quiet authority that did not need to announce itself to be felt, and as he entered, the room responded not with noise, but with stillness, the kind that forms when people understand that something important is about to happen, and he did not look around for approval, did not acknowledge the tension directly. He simply walked to the center of the room and stopped, his gaze steady, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, even, but it carried further than anyone expected. "You dismissed someone yesterday," he said, and no one interrupted, because there was nothing to interrupt, only truth unfolding, and the manager stepped forward, attempting to regain control of a moment that no longer belonged to him. But Jonathan raised his hand slightly, not to silence, but to guide, and continued, "You dismissed her," without listening, and the words settled into the space with a weight that could not be deflected, and he reached into his jacket, placing the folded note on the counter, unfolding it slowly, revealing the same precise handwriting that had changed everything. "She saw what none of you chose to see," he said, and then, without raising his voice, he explained, not dramatically, not emotionally, just clearly, the pattern, the adjustments, the quiet manipulation hidden within the system. And as the realization spread across the room, it did not come with shock, it came with recognition, because deep down, something had always felt slightly off, slightly misaligned, but no one had paused long enough to understand it, and Jonathan let the silence sit for a moment before finishing. "You did not lose a waitress," he said, his gaze steady, moving across the room. "You lost integrity," and the words did not accuse. They defined, and that made them impossible to ignore, and no one spoke. Not because they had nothing to say, but because nothing they could say would change what had already been revealed, and Jonathan stepped back slightly, not claiming space, but releasing it, allowing the room to absorb what it needed to, and outside, the city continued as it always did, unaware that inside, something fundamental had shifted, and several blocks away, Emily Carter walked along a quiet street, the morning light soft against the pavement, her step steady, her expression calm, and she did not know the exact words spoken. She did not see the moment unfold, but she did not need to, because the outcome had never been about recognition, it had been about truth, and as she reached the corner, she paused briefly, looking ahead, then continued forward, her path no longer tied to where she had been, but guided by something quieter, something stronger, and somewhere behind her, in a place she had already left, people would remember that day not because of what was said, but because of what was finally understood, that silence is not the absence of truth. It is often where truth waits, patient, steady, until someone chooses to listen.